Hi, Mr. Pikketty. Let's start by your book. It became a bestseller. Surprisingly, it's not very expectable from an economics/history book. Were you expecting this success?
Well, I tried hard to write a readable book, and I would really like to say that, this book is a bit long, and I apologize about this, but this is really a readable book. This can be read by anyone. So what I really try to show in this book is that the history of income and wealth and capital and public debt is not just an economic history. It is also a political history, a social, a cultural history. And so this book can be read by anyone. And I guess what the success of the book in Portugal, in France, in Brazil, in China is showing is that there is a strong demand in the world today for a sort of democratization of economic knowledge. There are many people who are tired to hear that issues of income and wealth are too complicated for them and should be left to a small group of experts, and that economists have developed a science that is so sophisticated that the rest of the world cannot understand. I think this is a big joke. I think there is no such thing as an economic science. I view myself more as a social scientist than as an economist or an historian. And I think all we can do as academics is to collect historical data, try to explain what we find, but there's always more than one explanation, and I certainly don't ask people to agree with all of my conclusions. I think my main objective in this book is to help normal people, citizens, to make their own mind about these important issues. And probably the main message is that there's always more than one solution. There are always alternatives. If you take the history of the public debt, which I describe in my book, you have public debt crises in the past which are even bigger than what we have today in Portugal or in Greece or in the Eurozone. And people always find solutions. And there's always more than one solution. And it's very important to look at this common history of inequality and debt and wealth in order to find better solutions for the future.
Before going to the main conclusions of the book, you've gained some worldwide recognition because of this book. You've already been called the new Marx, the modern-day Marx, also a rock star economist. Are you comfortable with these labels? Recently, Time magazine named you as one of the most influential names in contemporary story. Is it comfortable for you to live with these labels?
Well, I have no problem with the publicity as long as it gets more
helps.
people. Yeah, as long as it gets more people to read my book. So the book has sold more than 1.5 million copies in the world now. About 1/3 in the US, 1/3 in Europe, and 1/3 in Asia, mostly China, Japan, Korea. So I'm very happy with this success. So sometimes, of course, the success comes with strange reactions, where everybody wants to write something about the book, including without opening the book. So sometimes it gives it gives strange. But
but it launched the debate.
Yeah, that's part of the game. Look, I mean, the objective was to stimulate a large global debate on inequality. So the objective was.
Some point you out as the future Nobel Prize winner. Is that an ambition for you?
I don't really have this kind of of dream. I think the idea of an economic science to me is a little abstract. I think this book is as much a book of history as a book of economics. So I don't write a book for experts or for politicians. You write a book for normal people, or everybody who wants to read books.
Even those who don't have a degree in economics?
Yeah, of course not. No, this can be read by anyone. This is not at all a book for experts. So for me, the most important recognition is when I see people in Lisbon or in anywhere in the world who tell me that they usually don't read that kind of big academic book, and who tell me that they have understood everything until the end. And I meet thousands of people like this. I receive lots of messages, and to me this is the most important recognition.
Let's talk to that normal people you are referring. How would you summarize them, the contents of the book, the main conclusions?
Okay, so what's new in the book is that we have tried with over 30 scholars from several dozen countries to collect historical data on income and wealth since the 19th century. And we try to look at the evolution of income and wealth inequality over this period of time, which is an issue that people had been talking about for a long time, but with very little data. So in the 19th century, you mentioned Marx before, and Marx was writing about the possibility of rising inequality, but he didn't have any data or very little data, so it was difficult to talk about it. Now, in the 20th century, there was an attempt, in particular by an American economist called Simon Kuznets, to start collecting historical data, and he came with a very strong conclusion, which was a decline in income inequality in one country, the United States, between about 1910 and 1950. And all what we've done in this book is to extend this historical perspective to many more years and many more countries. One of our main conclusions is that in the end, the period of decline in inequality was really associated both in the US and in Europe to the very big shocks of the 20th century between 1914 and 1945. So there was this big reduction of inequality, which was due both to dramatic events like destruction of capital, and also in a more positive way to the new fiscal and social policies that were finally accepted by the elite in Western countries that were refused until World War I. You know, in my country, in France, the income tax was finally adopted in the summer of 1914, not to pay for schools, but to pay for the war, to go to war with Germany. But in the end, after these very violent shocks of World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, there was a new social and fiscal system that led to a much lower level of inequality in the 50s, 60s, 70s than what we had before. Now, starting in the 1980s with the Thatcher-Reagan revolution in Anglo-Saxon country, and even more so after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we enter into a new era of sometimes unlimited faith in self-regulated market with financial deregulation, with privatization, the decline of the role of unions, and we see in most countries an increase in inequality. Now, what about the future? Well, the main conclusion, probably, of the book is that there is no deterministic economic law that can predict the evolution of inequality. You have powerful forces going in both directions, and in the end, what determines the evolution of the concentration and inequality of income and wealth is really the set of institutions and policies that we choose. So this includes educational policy, labor market policy, progressive taxation of income and wealth. So there are different possible trajectories, and this is not an history that just depends on pure economic laws. So that's why it's very important to be all part of the history, because in the end, you know, these are these political choices that will determine the evolution.
So capitalism is not a problem itself, although it favors inequality.
No, it's not a problem itself. You know, I believe personally in a private property. I believe in market forces, in competition. But I think what we need is strong democratic institutions in order to put these powerful market forces into the right direction and into the common interest. And it will be a mistake to believe that natural forces by themselves, can make sure that this will go fine and this will be in the common interest. There are powerful forces that can push in every direction, including the direction of very high inequality. So markets are very useful in order to ensure a number of economic incentives, but they have no limits nor morality. They can lead to extremely concentrated distribution of income and wealth. I think what's even more important is to have a democratic institution that go together with very high transparency about income and wealth, so that we can adapt our policies, and in particular our tax policy and the different income and wealth group, to whatever evolution we observe. And I think one major risk that we face today, particularly in Europe, but all over the world. I traveled in China, in Brazil, and you have the same basic issue is the lack of transparency about who owns what in what countries. And in particular, you have all these cross-border financial assets in tax havens or in foreign countries where in the end, we don't really know who owns what. You know, in my country, in France, the first budget minister of Hollande, he had a bank account in Switzerland, and he was in charge of the tax system in France, but himself was not paying tax on his bank account in Switzerland. And what was incredible is that he thought that he could get away with it forever, that nobody would ever know, because there was no automatic transmission of information about this. And in Europe, more recently, you know, we had the Luxembourg leaks scandal with Jean-Claude Juncker, where we suddenly realized that many large multinational corporations in Europe were paying a tax rate that was close to 0%, and that was certainly much less than what our small and medium-sized companies are paying in Portugal or in France. And this is a situation, you know, this lack of transparency, I think, can be a major threat to our basic social contract, because if people in the middle class or in small and medium-sized corporations feel that they are paying more than people above them, that, you know, there is a risk that people at some point will just stop paying altogether. So this is our basic social contract that is at stake, and we cannot just rely on natural market forces to solve that. So we want capitalism to be the slave of democracy, and democratic institution and fiscal institution that can put them in the right direction, can put market and capitalist forces in the right direction, rather than the opposite, with democracy becoming the slave of capitalist forces.
Before going to concrete changes in European institutions, which you advocate, let's talk a bit about your ideas, some of the solutions you point out on the tax side. You propose a new global tax to solve this problem. Over fortunes. Can you elaborate?
Right. So we are not going to wait, you know, for a perfect, coordinated global government and global wealth tax to do something. So
you recognize it would be an utopia.
We need to. I believe in step-by-step progress. You know, I think we can make progress, you know, from what we can do at the national level to more European cooperation, and then more global cooperation. You know, for instance, you know, we are going to have a treaty between the European Union and the United States. Well, this will be a nice opportunity, maybe not to have a completely common tax, but at least to have a coordinated tax on large multinationals, so that they can pay a minimal amount of tax, and also for wealth and for cross-border financial assets. This will be the place to make progress. You know, we are going to put half of the world GDP around the table, because the US is about 20-25% of the world GDP. The European Union is also 20-25%. So if we put all of these people together, we have almost half of the world GDP around the table. So here we have no excuse not to do anything. You know, because usually we say, well, we are too small, we cannot do anything. But you know, if you cannot do something when you are half of the world GDP around the table, then when are you going to do something? So I think it's important to take whatever opportunity we have to have more transparency into the tax system. I think it's also important to remember that we can make progress at the national level, including in Portugal. You know, you can have a more equitable tax system, for instance, by having a tax on inherited wealth, which is an issue that is being discussed in Portugal right now, because there is no tax on inheritance in Portugal right now. The property tax, which is sometimes very strong tax for in particular the young people who are trying to access property and who have a lot of debt. So they have, in fact, very little net wealth. You know, when you have an apartment that's worth 300,000 euros in Lisbon, but you have a debt of 290,000 euros, you know, you're not really rich. And I think right now the property tax system in Portugal or in every European country is not progressive. So you have the same tax rate whether you have an apartment of 100,000 euros or 1 million, and you don't take into account the debt, the financial debt or the financial asset. So I think this could be changed, you know, at the level of Portugal or at the level of France. So national governments can still do a lot, and it will be a mistake, you know, to use the lack of European or international cooperation as an excuse for not doing the reforms that we can do at the national level. So we need to do both. We can make progress at the national level and at the same time try to make progress at the European and international level. Level.
Your critics say that the level of taxation you suggest on the book is not the solution because they argue that it's confiscatory and that it may have a negative effect by not creating incentives to generate wealth. Do you understand this point of view?
Let me make very clear that, not only I understand this point of view, but I certainly don't say that we should increase the overall level of taxation. I think when we have a total tax revenue of 40% or 50% of GDP, like what we have in France or in Portugal or in many European countries, I'm certainly not saying that we should increase this to 60 or 70% of GDP. So I think the overall level of taxation probably should not be increased. We should try to stabilize it. But for a given total level of taxation, you can have different tax systems. So you can have a more equitable, a more progressive tax system. So I think, generally speaking, in European countries right now, and in particular in a country like Portugal, we need to rebalance the tax system in favor of the young generation. So the young generation, right now they have very high unemployment rates. This is the main problem with inequality in Europe. Even when they have a job, they have wages which are stagnant or sometimes which have even been reduced. So I think the priority should be to try to reduce the tax burden on wages, and particularly low and middle wages, and to increase the tax burden on wealth and property and corporate profits. So if you take a country like Portugal, where you have a very high tax on labor, if you make 100,000 euros with your labor income, you will pay very large tax. But if you receive 100,000 euros through inheritance, or 1 million or 10 million euros, then you pay 0%. Now, is this fair? I don't think so. When you look at other countries, take Germany or Britain or the US or Japan or France, all of these countries, they have very different political tradition. They all have an inheritance tax. And if you take large wealth, above 1 million or 5 million euros, the tax rate on very large inheritance is of the order of 40%, 50%, just like for high incomes. And, Cameron or Merkel, they are not particularly left-wing, but they are not saying that they should, this 40% inheritance tax rate and large inheritance should be brought down to 0%. Or even in Japan recently, which is not a very left-wing government, they just increased the inheritance tax rate to 55% on large inheritance. It used to be 45%. So I know that this is an issue that is being discussed in Portugal right now, the possibility of introducing an inheritance tax. And I think this will go in the right direction if this will allow to reduce other tax, like social contribution and wages and labor taxation in general. So again, what I'm saying is not that we want to increase all tax. We want to keep the same total tax burden, but we can reduce some tax and increase others so as to adapt our tax system to the reality. And the reality is a world where the young generation have a difficult time finding a job, where labor income is stagnating, whereas property values and wealth levels have increased a lot, which makes it also very difficult for the young generation to access property. If you want to buy an apartment in Lisbon or in Paris today, and if you don't have family wealth, and if you only have your labor income, well, I don't know yet so much in Lisbon, but I can tell you in Paris you need to have a very, very high labor income. So I think it's important to rebalance the tax system to adapt it to the new situation.
After that national response, you advocate that there should be a coordinated European response to the problem with a common tax policy and a parliament for the countries of the Eurozone. Is that achievable?
Yeah, I think this is achievable, but we don't
because there's lots of tensions nowadays inside Europe, mainly because of Greece and the setback in the negotiations. It's not a good time to stimulate that debate, or am I wrong?
Well, it's certainly a difficult time. You know, you have a rise of nationalism everywhere. Certainly in my country, you know, you have a rise of the extreme right in France. But generally speaking, you have a rise of nationalism in Europe, where every country is trying to blame someone else, is trying to blame other countries. So in France, we blame Germany. Germany blames France or blames Greece. But you know, the reality is that we've not taken the right decision in 2011, 2012. You know, we've had too much austerity, we've killed growth, and with very low growth, very low inflation, and very high unemployment, it's just impossible to reduce the public debt. So we all have to recognize our responsibility. In particular, France and Germany, I think, have to recognize that they are partly responsible for the bad situation in Greece and in Southern Europe. They are not the only one responsible. The previous Greek government certainly also have a responsibility, but it's a collective responsibility. The decisions that have been taken
and it should be addressed as a responsible.
And it should be addressed collectively. You know, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy in this discussion because, for instance, you know, we're asking the Greek to improve their tax system, which is a very reasonable demand, because certainly the Greek tax system could be made more efficient. But at the same time, the French or German banks are very happy to receive the financial accounts and financial assets from rich Greek taxpayers without sending the information to the Greek tax administration. So, you know, it's very difficult for Greece alone to solve this problem of financial transparency. You know, even France and Germany don't manage on their own to make large multinational pay a tax rate that is just the same as their small and medium-sized companies. And with Luxembourg, etc., we end up in a situation where large multinationals don't pay any tax, or at least pay less. So how do you want Greece alone to solve the problem? So I think in the case of corporate taxation, that is the taxation of the profits made by large multinational corporations, I think we need a European tax, or at least a Eurozone tax. And if some countries like Luxembourg don't want to participate, okay, this is fine, but they should not make it impossible for France and Germany and Spain and Portugal and Italy and Greece to go in this direction. And then the countries that want to stay aside and that want to live out of financial opacity, you know, at some point they should pay the consequences. So I think it's important that in the Eurozone we stop to be naive and we stop to believe that competition between countries can solve every problem. I believe in the common market, in free capital flows, but we need some counterpart in terms of fiscal regulation, financial regulation, transparency. I think the public opinion in Europe is now ready to understand the fact that in terms of corporate taxation, taxation of large multinational, national sovereignty has become an illusion, largely. Because in the end, national sovereignty is just a game where we end up being screwed by large multinationals who don't pay tax anywhere. So I think it will be better collectively to delegate entirely the corporate tax, at least for large companies, to a Eurozone parliament, which in my view should be made of members from the national parliament, because it is where the national sovereignty is located, you know, the power to vote the budget, the power to vote taxation. This is where political legitimacy here, and so this is where we should you know, in this Eurozone parliament or Eurozone chamber based on national parliament, that we could have a common corporate tax, and also that we could take decision regarding the level of the deficit, the level of public investment. I think it's not possible to have automatic rules for budget deficit. These are political decisions. We need to be able to adapt the decision to the state of the economy through majority rule decision making. You cannot just have one country, Germany, or two countries, Germany and France, you know, taking decision about the speed of fiscal adjustment in Portugal and Greece. And these countries, you know, have taken wrong decision in the end. This was not terribly successful.
And it was an error, the speed imposed to countries under adjustment like Portugal or Greece.
Right, this was imposed on all of us, particularly on Southern European countries, and this was a failure. You know, if we look at the situation in the Eurozone in the past 5 years, between 2010 and 2015, and we compare to the United States, I think the comparison is terrible for us, for Eurozone countries, in the sense that 5 years ago, in 2010, we had the same unemployment rate, the same initial level of debt and deficit in the US and in the Eurozone. And 5 years later, in 2015, unemployment has increased a lot in the Eurozone and it has declined a lot in the US because they were more flexible with respect to the deficit level. They put growth first, whereas in the Eurozone, we try to reduce the deficit too fast. Of course, we need to reduce the deficit, but if we do it too fast with too strong reduction in public spendings or too strong increase in taxation, which is what we did in France and even more so in Portugal and in Southern Europe,
measures.
Then you have a big recession, you have huge unemployment, and how can you reduce the debt when you have zero growth, zero inflation, high unemployment? So this has been a failure, and I think if we want to save our common currency, and I think we want to save our common currency, then we have to supplement the common currency with political, democratic institution at the level of the Eurozone that will replace the automatic rules on deficit. So probably many people in Germany will not like this, but I think that if France and Spain and Portugal and Italy and Greece were putting a concrete proposal to change the European treaties on the table, then at some point a compromise would have to be worked out with Germany, because you cannot have forever a single currency if you don't want to trust democracy. And you cannot avoid democracy by putting everything in automatic rules which do not adapt very well to the economic situation.
And that for the problem of the debt, do you think that countries such as Portugal would benefit from restructuring debt?
I think that one of the lessons of history and of the history of public debt that I describe in my book is that you need some form of restructuring or some inflation or some exceptional decision like exceptional progressive tax on private wealth, or a combination of all of this in order to reduce such a large public debt. You know, one of the lessons of history is that when you have a public debt of 100% of GDP or 150% or even more in Greece, the idea is that you can reduce this with zero inflation, no restructuring, just by repaying budget surplus from year to year. You know, you can do the computation. You know, if you have a budget surplus of 1, 2, 3% of GDP each year, you know, it will take many decades to do this. And, you know, this is what our European agreements are supposed to tell us that we are going to do. So, you know, for instance, with Greece, according to our 2012 agreement, Greece is supposed to have a primary budget surplus of 4% of GDP for the next decades. Now, is this going to happen? No, this is not going to happen, and it will be a very bad economic strategy. It's important to realize, you know, these numbers may seem a little bit abstract to some people, but just to have a comparison, the total budget of the entire university system in a country like Greece or a country like Portugal or a country like France today is less than 1% of GDP. So are we going to put 4 times more resources out of our taxpayer money just to repay interest payment on our public debt than what we are investing in the young generation and in the skills of the young generation in our higher education system? This will be crazy. And so some people now say, well, you know, the situation is better, growth is back, the interest rates are low. But, you know, even you take a country like Portugal, right now, the total interest payment on the public debt, which is 130% of GDP, the annual interest payment are of the order of 5% of GDP each year, which is 5 times more money than what Portugal is investing in its entire higher education system. And for the whole of Europe, you know, this is not the right strategy. And I think it's important to remember that Germany and France did use debt restructuring and did use inflation in order to reduce their own public debt after World War II. You know, in 1945, Germany and France had 200% of GDP in public debt. And then in 1950, 1955, it was down to 0%, well, 20% of GDP. How did Germany and France do that? Well, of course, they did not repay this public debt because you would need budget surplus, enormous budget surplus to reduce such a large public debt in just 5 years. So what happened was a lot of inflation, a lot of debt restructuring, including the cancellation of the German foreign public debt in 1953, this famous London Agreement, which now the Greek government is talking about. And it's true that this was part of the story. Now, the bigger part, in fact, most of the German debt was domestic debt, so the bigger part was destroyed by inflation and by domestic debt restructuring. But in any case, the important point is that Germany and France never repaid their public debt. And now these two countries are explaining, Southern European countries that you will have to pay until the last euro with no inflation, with no debt restructuring. This is historical amnesia. And this is selfishness. And this is also, in the end, bad for everybody because, even in Germany, the bad situation in the Eurozone has bad consequences. And the growth rate in Germany right now is twice as less than what it is in Britain outside the Eurozone. So we need to find a better solution. We need more trust. We need more democracy. We have tried to replace democracy by these automatic budget rules. This is not working. And I think at the end of the day, we can get to better solution if we put solution on the table for new European treaties. So it's not enough just to complain about Germany, which in my country has become a national sport. I don't know about Portugal, but I think it's not enough. I think Germany has a big responsibility, in particular because of the historical amnesia I just referred to. But at the same time, it's important to put concrete proposal for new European treaties with the Eurozone Parliament or other proposal in order to show that there are specific, precise democratic institutions that will get us to a better decision.
But aren't we walking dangerously towards Brexit, or is that not so big of a danger?
Oh, I think this is a big danger, and I think Brexit will be a catastrophe for all of Europe because this will be the beginning of the end of the Eurozone. The next morning, financial markets will ask who is the next country, Portugal, Italy. There will always be, at the time of new elections, some financial panic and financial speculation. So if we are not able collectively to deal with the case of Greece, we will not be able to deal with the rest of the Eurozone. And I think some people believe that we should push Greece out, and I think some people in Germany and probably in some other countries as well believe this right now. I think this is a major historical mistake, and I think the political leaders, either in Portugal or in France or in Germany, who are pushing in this direction and who believe that this could be a solution, will bear an enormous responsibility in European history if they do this. So I hope and I think that a number of countries, including France and Italy, will block this kind of solution. But we are taking a lot of risk. We are always waiting for the last minute. In Europe, it's as if it's only when you have a financial panic that suddenly we find a solution. We are taking a lot of risk, and we should anticipate this risk and think about a better solution right now.
Very briefly, because we don't have any more time. What's your impression on Portugal after spending this day in meetings? Are you impressed? Do you think the worst is already passed behind us?
I think it will be a mistake in Portugal to believe that the worst is behind us and that growth is back and that interest rates are now low for everyone. I think the structural problem of the Eurozone and therefore of Portugal are not over. Yeah, I think a single currency with 18 different public debt, 18 different interest rates, 18 different tax systems in competition with one another. Well, this is a system that doesn't work, that will never work, and there will be other financial panic. I think there's a lack of confidence in the Eurozone simply because we don't know, we don't say clearly whether we want to stay together. And so, the European Central Bank is printing a lot of money in order to try to have a little bit more inflation and to encourage investment. But if private investors don't want to invest, they will not invest. And so this will create bubbles on some real estate asset price or stock market asset price. But, I think it would be a mistake to believe that the central bank alone can save the Eurozone. We need a democratic refoundation of the Eurozone with common corporate tax, common investment plan for infrastructure, for universities. You know, we need more political and fiscal and budgetary union if we really want to save the Eurozone. Austerity will not be enough.
There's room for hope. Thank you, Mr. Pikketty.
Thank you.